Setting and mysterious events in Riverfield in 1985. The small town of Riverfield, Oregon, nestled along the banks of the Blue River, was what many would call quintessentially American. It was one of those picturesque places where everyone knew everyone, where kids rode their bikes without a care in the world, and the 4th of July parade was the biggest celebration of the year. By day, the town seemed like it was pulled straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, with its tidy streets, a vintage diner called Millie's Spot, and an old red barn that stood proud at the edge of the town, a relic of its agrarian past. But Riverfield also had a slightly more lively side to it when the sun dipped below the horizon. Every Friday night, all the action moved to the Riverfield Night Market, a cozy strip that lined the boardwalk by the water. This vibrant night market was a combination of food trucks, live music, and a weekly farmer's fair, featuring everything from fresh-picked apples to quirky trinkets. It was where families brought their kids to enjoy corn dogs and lemonade, and where teenagers gathered secretly by the dock, pretending not to hear their parents calling out 11 p.m. curfews. One particular food truck stood out among the rest. Joe's Grill and Smokehouse, a food cart famous for its burgers and ribs, seemed to captivate the crowd week after week. The smoky aroma of sizzling meat pulled people in as if it had some kind of magnetic force, and the line for Joe's Grill often stretched far longer than most others. It wasn't glamorous, but it had that local legend vibe. Half of the town loved it, and the other half swore they'd never tasted meat so weirdly tender. By the summer of 1985, however, something began to feel off. Subtle at first, barely enough to get people talking. 15-year-old Amy Carter, a waitress at a nearby diner, noticed that she hadn't seen her co-worker, Lisa Mendez, for 3 shifts straight. Everyone thought Lisa had eloped with her secret boyfriend. But Amy confided in her mother saying, "Mom, Lisa seemed scared the last few times I saw her at work, like really scared." 1 week later, Jessica Olson, 20, the town baker's daughter, didn't show up for their family's delivery rounds. Her red station wagon was found abandoned 2 miles outside of town with the keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Jessica. People whispered, joked even, about how a local bad kid house might have scared her away. In reality, no one could figure out what had happened. 2 disappearances in less than a month might have gone unnoticed in a bigger city, but not in Riverfield. The whole town buzzed with concern. Sheriff Tom Grayson, who'd been with the department for nearly 30 years, made a statement to the Riverfield Gazette urging calm and promising that his team was looking into it. But privately, even Grayson was uneasy. There were no notes, no shady characters passing through town. It felt like these girls had just vanished. Then it happened again. This time, a 19-year-old babysitter named Claire Simmons failed to return home after watching 2 kids only 5 blocks from her house. Their mother, Susan Harper, reported that Claire had left around 10 p.m. She said goodbye, nice as ever. She was headed for her bike, but that was the last I saw of her, Susan told deputies. By this point, Riverfield could no longer brush it off. 3 young women were gone, and the disappearances showed no obvious connection, except for one chilling pattern. They all vanished on Fridays. The Riverfield Night Market, despite being the charm of the town, was beginning to develop an eerie reputation. Parents told their kids to avoid staying out past 8 p.m., and vendors noticed a distinct drop in foot traffic during the evening hours. "It's just some bad luck," said one vendor, but another, a quiet butcher named Frank Gilmore, muttered, "Bad luck doesn't leave bikes unlocked and station wagons running. Something's lurking between those boardwalk pines if you ask me." Weeks passed and the fear thickened as nothing was resolved. Grayson's deputies scoured the nearby forests along Blue River. Search dogs sniffed through the fields around town, but no clues surfaced. It was as though Riverfield was hiding a secret it didn't want uncovered. Beneath the facade of apple pies and PTA meetings, fear had begun to fester. One rainy September, the Riverfield Gazette published an article with the title, "The Shadows of Riverfield, a Small Town Under Siege," sparking heated debate among locals. Some said rumors of kidnappings and vanishings were overly exaggerated. Others believed something far more sinister was at play, pointing fingers at anything outside the ordinary, from teenagers drinking under the moonlight, to the increasingly quiet stretch of woods behind the night market. "That's where the answers are, it's those woods," one older resident mused, shaking his head as he puffed a cigar outside Millie's diner. The real turning point came during peak fall, when a fisherman in the river discovered something partially buried in the sediment of the riverbank. It was a watch, scratched but recognizable, that once belonged to Claire Simmons. Not far from the watch was a torn piece of fabric covered with a sticky dark substance later confirmed to be dried blood. With evidence pointing to foul play, the case escalated from missing persons to a possible murder investigation. Despite these revelations, the night market persisted, though far less lively than its glory days. "The weird thing is," one spectator commented, "Joe's Grill is still doing fine, maybe better than ever. That line doesn't end." Only Frank Gilmore, the butcher with a skeptical eye, dared voice suspicion. "Something ain't right about that stall," he whispered to no one in particular. Little did Riverfield know, years of buried horrors were about to surface on that very dirt path by the water. Members of the town would soon realize, Riverfield didn't just lose its peace, it housed something far darker than they could have ever imagined. Rang, Kien vu viech nan chong roi vau bitak. First discovery. The first sign that something truly unsettling had taken root in Riverfield came on a crisp October morning in 1985. The Blue River, which snaked lazily along the town's border, had begun its autumn transformation. Leaves floated on its surface, and a faint mist hovered over the water as the sun rose. For a pair of locals, however, what began as a peaceful day by the river quickly turned into a nightmare. Earl Thompson and his nephew, Danny, were regulars out by the riverbanks. Fishing was their routine, a solace away from the routine humdrum of the sleepy town. Earl's voice boomed through the quiet morning as he yelled at Danny for yet another lazy cast. "Damn it, Danny! You're scaring off the trout with casts like that! Focus!" All right, Earl," Danny replied with a shrug, half paying attention as the line went limp once more. The boy adjusted his trucker cap to block out the glare of the sun breaking through the trees. "Don't all right me if we're going home empty-handed," Earl grumbled, taking a swig from his thermos. "A man needs results in life, kid. Fish ain't just gonna jump in the boat." As Danny reeled the line back in yet again, something unusual caught his eye. It wasn't in the water but near the underbrush along the riverbank, something barely peeking out beneath a tangle of roots and mud. From a distance it looked like cloth, but there was something about it that made the boy uneasy. It didn't look like garbage or some random piece of litter. It had color to it, an unsettling teal. "Earl," Danny called out cautiously, his voice dropping. "What now?" Earl asked, not looking up from his tackle box as he prepared another lure. "You snagged something? I'm not wading in there if it's just some driftwood." "No, it's weird. Over there," Danny said, gesturing with the tip of his rod. Earl followed his nephew's gaze and immediately frowned. The two of them hesitated for a second before Earl grunted and grabbed his waders. "Stay here," he ordered. "Might as well check it out. Could be something someone dropped. Maybe money." Danny muttered a skeptical, "Yeah, sure," as Earl sloshed through the cold river water toward the underbrush. As Earl drew closer, he realized Danny wasn't imagining things. The fabric was real, half buried and snagged in the damp roots of an old elm tree. Earl bent down cautiously, using the edge of his fishing rod to prod it free. "Hell," he said, feeling a chill go up his spine. "This don't look right." The fabric wasn't just teal, it was torn. Stained. His stomach turned as he noticed streaks of what looked like mud mixed with something else. Rust-brown splotches dotted the material, and they weren't from the river. Earl knew what bloodstains on fabric looked like. He'd seen them enough in his younger days working at the slaughterhouse. This was blood. Old, maybe, but it was there. "What is it, Uncle Earl?" Danny called out. He had abandoned the boat to hover on the riverbank, craning his neck to get a better look. Earl didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted to something else beneath the fabric. Strands of what appeared to be hair. Not much. Just a few threads, blonde, but unmistakable. They were loose, stuck to the fabric like vines clinging onto rocks after a storm. Earl felt his pulse quicken. "Danny, stay back!" he finally barked, his tone sharper than before. Something about the discovery sent every alarm in his head blaring. The boy didn't argue. "Earl, what is it? Come on, man, you're freaking me out." "I said stay back!" Earl snapped, rising to his feet and folding the fabric as best as he could with trembling hands. His boots stumbled against the muddy ground on his way back to shore. By the time he reached the boat, Danny had gone completely silent. His uncle's pale face told him everything he needed to know. Whatever Earl found wasn't just weird, it was wrong. 30 minutes later, Earl and Danny were standing at the front counter of the Riverfield Sheriff's Station. Sheriff Tom Grayson leaned back in his creaky leather chair, regarding the stained bundle of fabric on his desk with furrowed brows. "You're sure about this?" Grayson asked, his voice calm but firm as he eyed Earl. The sheriff was in his early 50s and known for being unflappable during moments that would leave others shaken, but the weight of recent disappearances had clearly cracked part of his usual composure. "Sheriff, you think I'd waste my morning driving down here for fun?" Earl shot back, his gruff tone snapping through the room like a whip. "Look at it, Tom. That ain't mud, and those sure as hell are real hairs stuck to it." Grayson sighed, leaning forward. "No need for theatrics, Earl. We'll send it to the lab to confirm." But inside, even Grayson couldn't shake the feeling pooling in the pit of his stomach. It matched too well. Ever since the third missing girl had turned up nothing but a rumor, he had been flipping through case files every night, looking for threads of connection. Now, with this torn fabric, he felt like the first crack in the wall of mystery had appeared. Deputy Carl Mason stepped through the door with a clipboard. "Sheriff, you're gonna want to see this." "What now, Carl?" Grayson asked, gesturing for him to spit it out. "We found something else near the same stretch of river." The deputy paused, visibly unnerved. One of the search dogs sniffed out what looks like a purse. Couple of ID cards inside matched Jessica Olsen's description. Grayson's face darkened. Jessica Olsen had been missing for almost 2 months now, presumed to have driven off when her car was found abandoned. But the faint possibility she was alive had lingered like unwelcome fog. This new evidence, this fabric, this purse, was pointing toward something far less hopeful. Earl, who had been silently following the exchange, crossed his arms. "I'm just saying, Tom," he growled. "You got something ugly happening out there, whether you know it or not. I'd take another look near that damn night market while you're at it. That's where things started, ain't it?" Grayson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to Mason. "Get that purse and this fabric over to the lab. I want results by Friday, and call for another team to canvass Riverfield Woods again. Thorough this time." As the room quieted, Grayson slid the blood-stained fabric into an evidence bag, sealing it tight. His hands lingered, just for a moment, against the bag's smooth surface. He could hear Earl mumble under his breath on the way out of the station. "Bad business, Sheriff. Real bad business." Grayson couldn't disagree. Something was wrong in Riverfield. Something deeper, darker, and far more sinister than anything they had ever seen before. What started as whispers in a small-town diner was becoming a cold, hard fact. Riverfield wasn't safe anymore. Similarities between the victims. Sheriff Tom Grayson leaned back in his chair, the worn-out springs letting out a groan as he pinched the bridge of his nose. The map tacked onto the far wall of his office felt like it was mocking him. Red pushpins were scattered over it like drops of blood, each one marking the last known location of a missing young woman. 4 of them now, all gone without a trace. Deputy Carl Mason, standing by the desk with a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand, spoke up hesitantly. "Sheriff, I've been looking at this thing from every angle. Ain't no rhyme or reason here. Not a single damn pattern." Grayson dropped his hand and stared at the deputy, eyes sharp despite the late hour. "There's always a pattern, Carl. Always. People don't just vanish into thin air. Someone's taken them specifically. We're just not seeing the connection." Carl shrugged, taking a sip of coffee. "Yeah, but what? None of them are related. They don't all go to the same church, the same school, not even the same grocery store, far as I can tell." Grayson leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "But they all live here. They're local. That's gotta count for something. Let's stick to what we do know." He tapped a file spread open on the desk, one of several stacked chaotically in front of him. Amy Carter, high school junior, part-time waitress at Millie's Spot, last seen leaving work on the corner of 3rd and Maple. That was August 19th. "Right," Carl said, nodding. "And Lisa Mendez went missing 2 weeks before that, after she finished her shift cleaning rooms at the Riverfield Inn. Jessica Olsen," Grayson continued, tapping another file, "disappeared on her way home from dropping off bread deliveries. Then Claire Simmons. What'd she do? Babysitter?" "Babysitter," Carl confirmed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She finished up at the Harper house around 10 p.m. Mom says she waved goodbye like always, and that was that." Grayson sighed. The similarities were there, even if they weren't glaringly obvious. Each of the girls had been young, late teens or early 20s, each of them had been out at night, each had been walking or biking alone, and then there was the unshakable sense that this wasn't random. "Let's think bigger," the sheriff muttered, pushing his chair back to stand. He walked toward the map on the wall, hands clasped behind his back like a teacher about to explain a lesson. "What's the one place this whole damn town goes on a Friday night?" "The night market," Carl said immediately. Grayson turned, nodding slowly. "Exactly. Think about it. That place is packed every weekend. Families, teens, visitors passing through on a road trip. Nobody keeps track of who's coming and going." "The night market's a free-for-all," Carl admitted, scratching his chin. "You really think there's a connection there?" "I know it sounds thin," Grayson said, pacing now, "but it's too much of a coincidence. All 4 of them spent time at that market." Amy was always hanging out with her friends by the boardwalk after work. Lisa, she told her mama she was gonna grab a burger there the night she went missing. And Jessica delivered bread to Joe's Grill every Friday before she disappeared. Carl straightened up, his forehead wrinkling in thought. What about Claire? She didn't have no reason to be there, far as I know. She went straight from the Harper house to her bike. Not so fast, Grayson said, holding up a hand. You remember what we found in her purse when it washed up by the river? Carl frowned. Movie tickets? Exactly, Grayson said, his voice rising slightly. She was supposed to catch a late show with her boyfriend that night, after stopping by the market for some kettle corn. He told us that himself when we questioned him. Well, I'll be damned, Carl muttered, setting his coffee cup down. You think they were all plucked off at the night market? Grayson smirked grimly. Or on their way home from it. Maybe they got careless, maybe they got distracted, but something or someone used that market to their advantage. Carl sank into the chair opposite the desk, staring at the files. Okay, so we've got ourselves a hunting ground, but that don't tell us who's doing it or why. Not yet, Grayson agreed. But it narrows the field. Let's keep going. What else do we know? Carl flipped through one of the files, mumbling as he scanned it. All 4 victims are female. All of them are petite, under 120 pounds, not trying to be crass, but that can't be a coincidence either. Whoever this is, they're going for girls who'd, be easier to handle. Grayson nodded grimly. Makes sense. A 19-year-old jogger? She's not gonna put up the same fight as, say, your cousin Frank down at the butcher shop. Carl snorted. Frank wouldn't go down without gut-punching someone first. You're right, though. These girls are small, young, and they're not packing heat like half the men in this town. More than that, Grayson said, flipping through the stack of files again. They're all suburban kids, Carl. No street smarts, no survival skills. Think about it. When was the last time this town saw anything even close to violent crime? 15 years ago, maybe? Carl whistled softly. You're saying they had their guard down, trusting the wrong person. That's exactly what I'm saying, Grayson replied. His finger landed on the words, last seen leaving in one of the reports. And you know where I think that trust came from? Where? Food, Grayson said matter-of-factly. Lisa was on her way to grab a burger. Amy always got fries at the snack shack by the boardwalk. Even Claire was going for kettle corn. What if, just maybe, our guy's at the market? Someone working there? Someone the girls wouldn't think twice about talking to? Oh hell, Carl muttered, rubbing his temples. You think it's a vendor, like what? Joe from Joe's Grill? I don't know yet, Grayson admitted, but you said it yourself. Nobody notices the night market vendors, they're just part of the scenery, but if they're local they'd know when these girls were alone. They'd know the shortcuts home. Hell, they'd probably blend in right after doing it. Carl fell silent, sitting with the weight of the conversation. We need to dig deeper, the sheriff said finally, slapping his hand on the desk. Get me a list of every vendor who's been at that market for the last year. I want their hours, their connections, what they sell, everything. If these girls were targeted there, then somebody working that market knows something. Carl nodded and stood. Got it. I'll start knocking on doors first thing tomorrow morning. Grayson nodded, watching as Carl left the room. Alone again, he turned back to the map on the wall. The red pins seemed to mock him, but now there was a glimmer of hope. And a hunch, just a small one, that the guy he was looking for had spent every damn Friday night grilling burgers, flipping cash, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the trusting, unsuspecting crowd. Unusual clue at an abandoned farm outside of town. The old Parker farm had always been an afterthought to the people of Riverfield, barely more than a distant set of structures that sat, weather-worn and forgotten, on a dirt road just outside town. Nobody went there. There wasn't a reason to. The surrounding fields had grown wild, the barn's roof had started caving in years ago, and the house itself had managed to earn a reputation as one of the town's creepiest sights. Kids dared each other to approach it on Halloween, whispering about ghosts or strange noises that supposedly came from the property late at night. Most adults simply shrugged it off, just another relic of better times. But after Deputy Carl Mason got an anonymous tip involving the Parker farm and its proximity to the Blue River, it seemed the abandoned property was no longer something the sheriff's department could ignore. Sheriff Tom Grayson had a bad feeling before they had even pulled into the cracked driveway. I swear to God, Carl, if this is just another wild goose chase, I'm going to throw you out of the car before we head back to town, Grayson muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of the department's battered Chevy Blazer. Carl Mason, riding shotgun, shrugged with something halfway between amusement and genuine unease. "I'm just saying, Sheriff, the guy who called, whoever the hell he was, sounded real nervous. Told me he saw a couple of trucks coming in and out of this place some nights. Said nobody around here's been working this land in years. That don't make your radar ping?" "My radar's been pinging since the Olsen girl went missing," Grayson replied, steering the vehicle to a halt in front of the sagging wooden farmhouse. "That doesn't mean we're gonna find anything but raccoons and tumbleweeds out here." Still, as the two climbed out of the Blazer, neither could fully ignore the weight in the air. Maybe it was the way the skeletal frame of the house leaned precariously like it might topple over any second, or maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence you only found far enough from anything alive. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, just the soft crunch of their boots on the dirt path as they approached the property. "Looks just as cheery as a tombstone," Carl observed, pulling out a flashlight even though there were still a few hours of daylight left. "You sure you don't want to call for backup?" Grayson shot him a look. "And have half the damn town talking about how we can't handle a rundown farm? No thanks. Let's see what we're dealing with first." As they stepped closer to the porch, it became obvious that the house hadn't been empty for as long as everyone in town seemed to think. The front door, barely hanging on its hinges, had fresh scuff marks as if it had been kicked open just days ago. Grayson knelt, running his fingers over the marks. "This wasn't wind damage," he muttered. Carl knelt beside him, frowning. "Look here," he said, pointing to something on the ground just beyond the threshold of the doorway. It was faint, but unmistakable, a partial boot print stamped into the dust-coated floor. It was larger than either of their own, the sole deeply ridged and rugged like something someone working outdoor shifts might wear. Grayson stood and took a slow look around. The smell hit him next, faint but distinct, a cloying metallic tang that brought with it an unwelcome memory of the autopsy room back when he was a rookie. "You smell that?" Grayson asked, his voice low. Carl sniffed once and winced. "Yeah, that's what I was afraid of." Whatever optimism, or sarcasm, Carl had clung to earlier vanished as they pushed further into the house. The living room was coated in layers of dust, cobwebs strewn from every corner, but it was the items out of place that caught their attention. A rusted folding chair sat in the middle of the room, alongside a battered work lamp plugged into an extension cord running outside. The lamp hadn't been there long, it looked clean compared to everything else. "Who the hell hauls a damn work lamp into a place like this?" Carl asked, his flashlight darting over the scene. "Someone who doesn't want to be seen after sunset," Grayson replied, stepping past the chair cautiously. His eyes swept the room, landing on a blanket tossed carelessly against the far wall. "And someone who doesn't care about cleaning up after themselves." He kicked the blanket back with the heel of his boot, revealing a plastic bucket partially filled with what looked like sawdust or mulch. A low, acrid smell wafted up from the bucket, making Carl grimace. "What the Christ is that? Gasoline-soaked sawdust?" Carl asked as he leaned in for a closer look, only to recoil instantly. "Oh God! Sheriff, look at this!" Grayson moved in quickly, his gut tightening as Carl fished out what looked like a chunk of burnt fabric from the edge of the sawdust pile. Grayson recoiled slightly when he saw it. Days-old charred cloth, with more stains that he didn't need a forensics team to identify. Dark red blotches had seeped deep into the material, the edges of the fabric frayed in a way that reminded him of an animal clawing desperately against a trap. Grayson's jaw clenched. "You think this could belong to—" "One of them? Maybe," Carl interrupted grimly. "Or worse." Neither of them liked leaving questions unanswered, but before they could interrogate the scene further, a faint creak echoed from above them. They froze. "What the hell was that?" Carl whispered, his hand automatically dropping to his holstered sidearm. Grayson held up a hand for silence, his pulse quickening as his gaze darted to the rotting staircase just down the hallway. He could have sworn he caught a shadow shift ever so slightly on the landing. Another creak followed, this time more deliberate. "Sounds like we're not alone," Grayson muttered under his breath. He motioned for Carl to cover him as the two crept toward the stairs, their steps soundless in a way that seemed to blend into the silence around them. Grayson's old revolver led the way as they ascended the staircase. When they reached the top, there was nothing but empty bedrooms and a breeze snaking through broken windows. Whoever, or whatever, had been up there, was gone now. They spent the better part of the next hour searching the farmhouse and its surrounding yard. Behind the main house, they came across a small shed, its door locked with a thick padlock that looked far newer than the rest of the farm. Carl shook his head. "Who the hell abandons a farm but keeps locking things up?" "We'll get bolt cutters out here tomorrow," Grayson said firmly, "and we'll have a team sweep this whole damn place." Carl's unease deepened as they spotted tire tracks carving through the dirt behind the shed. "Someone's been using this place, that's for sure. The trucks, the footprints, now this padlock. This isn't just squatters, Sheriff, this is something else." Grayson nodded, his eyes dark. "Whoever's been here ain't just hiding. They're running an operation. Question is, what in God's name are they hiding in that shed?" As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the two men knew one thing for sure. They'd uncovered just enough to make them long for less. Whatever was happening at the Parker farm, it wasn't going to end quietly. Following the lead from the delivery driver. The Parker farm had been a dead end in Sheriff Tom Grayson's eyes. At least that's what he thought initially. No one had lived there for years, and while they'd found unsettling evidence during the first sweep, nothing pointed them toward a suspect. The forensics teams weren't moving fast enough, and the townspeople were growing restless. That's when the tip about the delivery driver came in. Deputy Carl Mason had received the call late one evening from a regular informant, a nosy farmer out near the old county highway. Apparently the man had overheard some odd chatter at a truck stop on the other side of town. A delivery driver hauling supplies had mentioned late-night deliveries to Parker Farm. The story immediately caught Carl's attention. The following morning, Grayson and Mason sat together in Millie's spot, the town diner, waiting for the driver to show up. Carl had arranged the meeting, promising the man complete anonymity. "Think this guy's legit?" Grayson asked, swirling a cup of tar-black coffee. His eyes looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. Frankly, he hadn't. "I don't know," Carl admitted. He was chewing on the end of a toothpick, something he always did when he was nervous. "If he's not, we'll kick him out the door. But if he's seen what I think he's seen—" He trailed off, glancing toward the door. Grayson nodded, not needing Carl to finish the sentence. Riverfield wasn't some bustling city with endless leads. Little crumbs like this were all they had. A few minutes later, a gruff-looking man in his mid-50s wandered through the diner doors. He wore a stained ball cap and a denim jacket that looked older than Grayson himself. Carl raised his hand to wave him over. "You Mason?" the man asked, stopping by the booth and giving Grayson a wary glance. "That's me, and this here's Sheriff Grayson," Carl replied, scooting over to make room. "Appreciate you taking the time to talk." The man hesitated, looking around the nearly empty diner before sliding into the booth. "Yeah, well, I don't usually stick my neck out for strangers, but I don't know, something didn't sit right with me about that place. Figured I ought to speak up." "Why don't you start by telling us your name?" Grayson asked, his voice calm but firm. "Name's Hank," the man muttered, pulling off his cap and setting it on the table. "I do deliveries for one of those meat distributors over in Winchester. Mostly livestock feed, but we do other stuff too. Tools, equipment, farm supplies, you get the idea." Grayson nodded, gesturing with his hand for Hank to continue. "Anyway," Hank said, lowering his voice, "about a year ago, some guy calls my company and places a big order. Paid cash up front. Said it was for some farm out near Riverfield. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just another guy looking to fix up some old property." "What kind of supplies are we talking about?" Carl interjected. Hank scratched the back of his neck. "A lot of heavy-duty stuff. Chains, saw blades, tarps, plastic sheeting. Bought 'em in bulk, too. It wasn't until the second delivery that I started thinking it was weird." "Second delivery?" Grayson asked sharply, his brows furrowing. "How many deliveries did you make out there?" "4, Hank said, holding up 4 fingers. "And every time it was the same routine. They'd meet me out near that beat-up barn, load the stuff themselves and tell me to get lost. They didn't want me hanging around." "Who's they?" Grayson pressed. "How many people are we talking about?" 3, maybe 4, Hank said, his brow creasing as he thought. "There was one guy who did most of the talking. Big fella, real muscular, always wearing gloves. The others mostly kept to themselves, kinda looked like they'd been rolling in mud half the damn time. None of them ever gave me a name." "Gloves," Carl muttered, glancing at Grayson. "Interesting. Why's that stand out to you?" Grayson asked Hank, narrowing his eyes. Hank shrugged. "I've been in this business a long time, Sheriff. You see a farmer wearing gloves, that's normal. But this guy, he wasn't wearing work gloves. They were black, like something you'd see in a crime show." Grayson let out a long breath, his instincts prickling. "What else can you tell us about this big guy? Any distinguishing features?" "Not much," Hank admitted. "Tall, maybe 6'5", bald, had this deep voice kinda gravelly, and he always seemed off, you know? Like the way he looked at you made your skin crawl." Carl leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. What about the property itself? You ever go inside the barn or the house? Hell no, Hank said, shaking his head quickly. They made it real clear I wasn't welcome past the fence line. One time I tried to stick around to make sure they got their order unloaded okay, and let's just say the big guy didn't appreciate it. What did he do? Grayson asked. Stepped in real close, Hank said, gesturing with his hand as though the memory was still fresh. Didn't say a word at first, just stared. Then he points to the road and says, "You don't want to be here after dark. You better believe I left." Jesus, Carl muttered, exchanging a glance with Grayson. Hank sighed, rubbing his hands nervously. Look, I didn't think much of it at first. Figured it was just a bunch of oddballs squatting on an old farm. But then I heard about those girls going missing and, I don't know, something about that place ain't right. You're damn right about that, Grayson said, his voice low. You've given us a lot to work with, Hank. I'm gonna need the name of your employer and the exact dates of those deliveries. Can you do that? Hank nodded. Yeah, I'll write it down for you, but, promise me one thing, Sheriff. What's that? Don't tell him I talked to you, Hank said, his voice dropping even lower. The big guy, if he finds out— He won't, Grayson assured him. You've done your part. We'll take it from here. An hour later, back at the station, Grayson and Carl reviewed the notes Hank had left them. The mention of chains, tarps, and saw blades had set off alarm bells in Grayson's mind. They were starting to piece together a picture, one they didn't like. You think this big guy is our lead? Carl asked, leaning against the edge of his desk. He's not just a lead, Grayson said grimly, rubbing his temples. I think he's running the whole damn show, and we're gonna find him. Carl smiled wryly. Well, I guess we know where we're headed next. Parker Farm, Grayson said, his voice steely. And this time we aren't leaving until we find something. Carl grabbed his hat and nodded. Let's hope your instincts are right, Sheriff. 'Cause if they're not, we're stuck right back at square one. Grayson didn't reply. He didn't have to. Deep down, he was certain Hank's story had cracked the case wide open. It was just a matter of how much worse it would get before they found the truth. Discovery of the mysterious basement. When Sheriff Tom Grayson's team returned to Parker Farm for the second time, tensions were running high. The previous trip left them with too many unanswered questions: blood-stained fabrics, signs of recent activity, and that locked shed with tire tracks trailing off into the unknown. But this time, Grayson wasn't leaving without answers. He brought bolt cutters, floodlights, and enough manpower to comb through every square inch of the property. The autumn sun was hanging low by the time the crew arrived, casting long shadows over the crumbling structure of the farmhouse. The air was colder than the week before, and the silence around them felt almost unnerving. "This place gives me the damn creeps," muttered Deputy Carl Mason as he pulled open the hatch of the Blazer to grab their tools. Grayson gave him a sidelong look. "You aren't the only one." He hefted the bolt cutters over his shoulder and motioned toward the house. "Let's get moving. We've wasted enough time already." They entered the Parker farmhouse with deliberate caution, flashlights slicing through the dim interior as dust swirled in faint beams of light. For the first hour, it felt like more of the same: rotting wood, broken furniture, and seemingly random objects left behind in a hurry. But just as Grayson was about to call the search and focus on the shed out back, one of his deputies shouted from the kitchen, "Sheriff, you're gonna want to see this." Grayson strode into the room with Mason on his heels. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of musty rot, with cabinets hanging off their hinges and a rusted stove sitting awkwardly in the corner. But the deputy wasn't looking at any of that. He was crouched by an old armoire shoved haphazardly against a wall. "What is it?" Grayson asked, his voice sharp. The deputy grunted as he moved the heavy furniture aside, revealing a set of wooden planks that didn't match the rest of the floor. They were nailed hastily over a dark square outline, a trapdoor. "Looks like we found ourselves a basement," the deputy said, his eyes wide. Mason leaned closer, running his hand over the edges of the trapdoor. "This wasn't part of the original house. You can tell by the boards. Someone added this in after the fact." "Well," Grayson said, his jaw tightening, "let's find out why." He gestured for the deputy to pry it open. With a crowbar and some determined effort, the boards were wrenched free, revealing a metal door embedded in the floor. It had a crude handle and seemed too new compared to the rest of the house. The rusted combination lock dangling from the latch suggested someone hadn't expected visitors anytime soon. Grayson handed Mason the bolt cutters. "You know what to do." Mason gave a tight nod, snapping through the lock with a single squeeze. The metal clattered to the floor, echoing ominously in the still room. Grayson grabbed the handle, hesitating for just a moment, before pulling the door open with a deafening creak. The smell hit them first, a pungent mix of mold, damp earth, and something else, something metallic, something wrong. Jesus Christ, Mason muttered under his breath, covering his nose with his sleeve. Grayson aimed his flashlight down the narrow wooden staircase leading into the dark. "All right, everyone stay sharp, watch your step, and if you see anything, call it out immediately." The basement was far larger than it had any right to be. The narrow staircase opened into a cavern-like space dug deep into the earth. The walls were lined with rough concrete, and the occasional muddy root snaked its way through cracks in the foundation. The beam of Grayson's flashlight revealed the strangest part. The room wasn't empty. Against one wall there were rows of workbenches covered in tools, saws, knives, and other implements that looked far too industrial for casual farm use. Many were stained with what looked like rust, though everyone in the room quietly assumed otherwise. "Christ almighty," Mason muttered, shining his own flashlight along the walls. "What the hell is all this?" Grayson didn't respond, his attention fixed on a large object in the center of the room. It was a table. No, a metal slab. Circular drain holes dotted its surface, and the legs were bolted into the floor. Straps hung loosely from each corner, their ends frayed and stained. Whatever this was, it wasn't for farm work. "Looks like we found their workshop," Grayson said, his voice tight. He motioned for one of the deputies to start snapping photographs. In the far corner of the room, they discovered a steel locker that had been padlocked. Much like the trapdoor, the lock took little effort with their tools. Inside they found rows of plastic containers, each marked with numbers and dates. Grayson popped one open and immediately regretted it. The stench of decay hit him like a freight train. Inside were chunks of what appeared to be animal meat, or so they hoped. "Sheriff," Mason's voice was shaky, almost confused. "You're gonna want to see this." Grayson turned and found Mason standing by what appeared to be a drain embedded into the floor. It was surrounded by stains, dark, old, baked into the concrete. The rusty cover had been pried halfway open, and stuffed inside were scraps of fabric. Grayson knelt to get a better look, carefully extracting one of the pieces with gloved hands. The fabric was unmistakably human, a torn sleeve, the edge frayed with smears of old blood. On closer inspection, Grayson noticed something worse, a name written in faded ink on the inside. "Lisa Mendez," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Mason cursed under his breath. "This is it, Sheriff. This is where it's been happening." Grayson didn't reply. His mind raced with possibilities. What else had been done here, how long it had been going on, and who the hell was behind it? One thing was certain. This wasn't just a basement. It was a slaughterhouse. An hour later, forensic teams were called to process the scene. Grayson stood outside the farmhouse, staring at the long expanse of wild fields surrounding it. Somewhere out there, someone was running loose. Someone capable of turning a basement into a cavern of horrors. "We've got a problem," Mason said, stepping beside him and lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. Grayson smirked grimly. "Yeah, Carl, we do." "This isn't just some sicko working alone," Mason continued. "Look at all that. The tools, the space, the setup. That's organized." Grayson nodded, his jaw tight. "Means they've done this before. And if we can't stop them—" He didn't finish his sentence. Instead, Grayson stared into the horizon, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing heavy on his shoulders. What had started as whispers of missing girls in a small town had now become something far darker. Something none of them were ready for. And deep down, Grayson feared this was only the beginning. The suspect begins to flee. The air in the Riverfield Sheriff's Office was thick with tension. Days had turned into weeks since the discovery of the mysterious basement at Parker Farm, and while the evidence they'd found painted a horrifying picture, it did little to narrow their search for the person, or people, responsible. Sheriff Tom Grayson could feel the eyes of the entire town boring into him every time he stopped by the diner or filled up at the gas station. They needed answers, and fast. "You read the report from the lab?" Deputy Carl Mason asked, breaking the silence in Grayson's office. Carl stood by the filing cabinet, one hand resting on its edge, the other gripping a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I read it," Grayson replied flatly, scanning the pages in front of him like he was trying to will the words into assembling something coherent. "Blood matches Lisa Mendez. The fibers in the drain matched Jessica Olsen's dress. And those containers from the basement? Yeah, they didn't come from no cow." He slammed the folder shut. "It's as bad as we thought." Carl shifted uncomfortably. "So, we're sure it's the same guy? Or guys?" Grayson nodded, leaning back in his chair with a weary sigh. "It's them. All of it ties back to the same operation. The missing girls, the makeshift slaughterhouse, the damn night market vendors. But until we catch one of these bastards and make 'em talk, we're chasing ghosts. That's when the call came in. Grayson reached for the phone on the second ring, his tone short as always. Grayson. The words on the other end were frantic, rushed, so much so that Grayson had to press the phone tightly to his ear. Slow down, he barked. Who is this? It's Eddie Larson. Look, I don't know if this is anything, Sheriff, but I saw him. Grayson straightened in his chair. Saw who? His voice was calm now, calculated. The guy, Sheriff. The tall one, bald, black gloves, I swear it was him. He was packing up his van at Joe's Grill before sunrise. I didn't think much of it at first, but now, Grayson cut him off. Did you see which way he went? North, Eddie replied quickly. Out toward the county line. Sheriff, he looked like he was in a hurry. You don't think— Thanks, Eddie, Grayson interrupted. He hung up before Eddie could finish. Carl, grab your coat and your damn notebook. We've got something. Carl was already halfway to the door. What is it? Grayson grabbed the keys to the Blazer, his mind racing. Our bald friend from Parker Farm? He's running! By the time they hit the road, the sun had barely begun to rise, the edges of the horizon just starting to glow with a pale, grayish light. Grayson had the gas pedal pressed hard, the old Blazer grumbling as it sped along the winding back roads of Riverfield. Carl flipped through the notepad balanced on his lap, rereading every detail they had about the suspect. So what's the plan here? Carl asked. We just hope to catch this guy at a red light? Grayson shot him a quick glare. We don't need hope. We've got instincts. If he's running, he's got a place in mind. Somewhere he thinks will keep him safe long enough to cover his tracks. Carl nodded, tapping the pen against the notepad in thought. You think he's going back to Parker Farm? Or somewhere else? Too obvious, Grayson said, his voice tight as he navigated a sharp turn. Farm's already compromised. He's smart enough to know that. My guess? If he's running, he's headed for something less permanent. Maybe a safe house. Something off the books. Carl raised an eyebrow. What, like some shady motel off the interstate? Exactly, Grayson said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. These guys don't disappear without a plan. They've set something up. After an hour of driving, they pulled into the dusty parking lot of a rundown gas station near the county line. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 60s, complete with a flickering neon open sign fighting to stay on. Grayson felt the unease settle in his gut as he parked. The gas station was quiet, too quiet for somewhere so close to the main highway. Carl glanced around, his hand instinctively resting near his holstered sidearm. How'd you know to stop here? Carl asked as they stepped out of the vehicle, gravel crunching under their boots. Grayson scanned the lot, his eyes narrowing on a dented white van backed into the far corner. Something about this place feels wrong, and that van over there? Same make, same model Eddie described. Carl let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. The two approached the van carefully, staying low by the rusted pumps until they were close enough to see through the windshield. The inside was cluttered, tarps, empty fast food bags, and something that might have been a toolbox sitting on the passenger seat. No sign of anyone inside. Grayson motioned for Carl to circle around the back while he moved toward the front. His revolver was drawn now, steady and ready. Just as he reached the driver's side door, a loud clatter came from behind the gas station. Both men snapped to attention, Carl already moving toward the noise. What the hell was that? Carl muttered under his breath as he crept toward the dumpsters. Grayson didn't answer. His instincts told him everything he needed to know. Whoever they were looking for wasn't going down without a fight. Behind the station, a tall figure was already scrambling to climb the chain-link fence that separated the property from a wooded area beyond. Carl's shout was sharp and immediate. Sheriff, he's running! Grayson didn't waste a second. Stop! Riverfield Sheriff's Department! He barked, breaking into a sprint, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement. The suspect didn't stop. His thick boots kicked against the fence as he dragged himself over the top, landing in the dirt on the other side without pause. Grayson could see the dark gloves even from a distance, and his gut told him this was their man. Stay on him! Grayson yelled to Carl, who was already struggling to keep pace. The chase led them deep into the woods, branches whipping against their faces as they pushed through the dense undergrowth. Grayson's lungs burned, but he kept moving, adrenaline dulling the ache in his legs. The suspect was fast, but he ran like someone who wasn't used to being chased, his movements erratic, frantic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, the man stumbled. His foot caught a root and he went down hard, his hands slamming against the dirt, Grayson and Carl were on him in seconds, their weapons drawn. "Don't move!" Grayson barked, his voice echoing through the trees. The man froze, his gloved hands hovering just above the ground. For a moment all that could be heard was the sound of their ragged breathing. Then Grayson stepped closer, his revolver unwavering. "Turn around!" he ordered. Slowly the man complied, his bald head catching what little light filtered through the canopy. His face was blank, no panic, no fear, just cold, unflinching defiance. Carl pulled out his cuffs, snapping them onto the man's wrists with a sharp click. "You're done, pal." Grayson stared at the suspect, his mind racing. This was no drifter. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just running. He was planning something bigger. "You're not gonna talk," Grayson said quietly, more to himself than to the man. "But I know you're part of something, and mark my words, we're gonna tear it apart." For the first time, the man smiled, a slow, chilling grin that made Grayson's stomach turn. "Good luck, Sheriff," the suspect said, his gravelly voice dripping with mockery. And just like that, Grayson knew the real fight was only beginning. Discovery of more blood in the forest tunnel. The forest near Riverfield had always been a place kids used as a playground, a backdrop for make-believe adventures or the occasional scary story shared around a campfire. But for Sheriff Tom Grayson, the forest had slowly transformed from a symbol of small-town charm into a breeding ground for secrets, shadows, and now, blood. It started with a boy. The call came in through dispatch just after lunch. Carl Mason leaned into Grayson's office with a half-eaten sandwich in one hand and an odd look on his face. "Sheriff, you're gonna want to hear this," Carl said, his voice dry but tinged with curiosity. "What is it now?" Grayson asked, barely glancing up from the mountain of paperwork on his desk. "Local kid, I think it's one of the Fisher boys, found something weird out in the woods. Says he was playing near some old tunnel or drainage pipe and—" Carl trailed off, scratching the back of his head. "Well, kid says there was blood, a lot of it." That got Grayson to look up. "He's not just fooling around, is he?" Grayson asked, his tone as skeptical as it was annoyed. "It's not hunting season. Could be animal blood, could be anything." Carl shrugged. "Maybe, but the kid's daddy called in too, said the stuff smeared on the ground didn't look like no deer blood and there were some bones nearby, not the animal kind. I told him we'd come take a look." With a groan, Grayson pushed his chair back and grabbed his hat. "Fine, grab the kit and let's head out. But if this ends up being ketchup or some dog getting into a fight with a raccoon, you're buying me coffee for the rest of the week." Carl smirked. "Fair deal." The drive out to the Fisher property didn't take long. The Fishers lived on the outskirts of town, in one of those older homes where the paint peeled but the yard was immaculate. The boy who called it in was waiting with his dad on the porch, his face pale and his hands shoved deep into his oversized hoodie. "Afternoon, Mr. Fisher," Grayson said, tipping his hat. "This your boy who found our little mess in the woods?" The father nodded, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Isaac, tell the sheriff what you saw." The boy hesitated, his sneakers scuffing the porch. "I was just playing by the old tunnel, you know. The big cement one near the creek. I wasn't doing nothing wrong, I swear." He looked nervous now, glancing at both his dad and Grayson, as if he might be punished. "Easy, son," Grayson said gently. "You're not in trouble. Just tell me what happened." "Well, I noticed something sticking out of the weeds by the pipe," Isaac began, fiddling with the hem of his hoodie. "It looked like a piece of cloth, so I went closer to see. And then I saw the red stuff all over, on the ground, on the walls of the pipe. It didn't look right, it looked like blood," Grayson finished. The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, and there are bones, too. Not a lot, but some of them were sticking out near the edge of the tunnel." Carl let out a low whistle. "That true, Mr. Fisher?" he asked the father. Mr. Fisher frowned. "I saw it myself after Isaac ran back home. Didn't touch it, though. Figured the cops need to see that kind of thing before anyone messes with it." Grayson glanced at Carl, then back at the boy. "You did good, Isaac. Real good. Now how about you tell Deputy Mason here exactly where this tunnel is and let us take a closer look?" The sheriff's truck rumbled through the uneven trails of the woods as Grayson and Carl drove out to where Isaac had described the tunnel. The forest was quiet, unnervingly quiet. "Think it's legit?" Carl asked, his eyes fixed on the dense stretch of trees ahead. "Feels bad if it's not," Grayson replied, gripping the wheel tighter as he navigated a muddy patch. Kid was shaking like a leaf, not like he saw ketchup in a pipe. Soon, they reached the edge of the creek. Just as Isaac had described, a large concrete drainage tunnel peeked out from the underbrush. Thick vines hung from the edges as if trying to pull the structure back into the ground. Carl stepped out of the truck with a flashlight in one hand and his sidearm holstered tightly. "Well, it does look creepy as hell, I'll give the kid that." Grayson grabbed his own flashlight and started toward the tunnel. The closer they got, the more apparent it became that something was very, very wrong. Just outside the mouth of the pipe, reddish smears streaked across the weeds and dirt. A scrap of blue fabric fluttered faintly in the breeze, caught on a thorny branch. "That's blood," Grayson muttered, crouching down to take a closer look. His gloved hand traced the darkened streaks where they soaked into the soil. He shined his flashlight toward the pipe and his stomach sank. Inside the tunnel, additional smears were splattered haphazardly on the walls as though something, or someone, had tried to drag themselves along. Farther in, something small glinted in the light. Bones, a few scattered fragments, some splintered, some eerily clean. "Oh hell," Carl whispered, lingering at the entrance. "This ain't no animal, Sheriff. Look at this." He gestured toward a jagged shard of bone caught in a tangling root. "That's human, no question." Grayson took a slow, deep breath, the weight of the discovery settling over him. "All right," he said quietly, turning toward Carl. "Call for backup. Tape off the area. We're gonna treat this like a crime scene." 2 hours later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, forensics teams had descended on the area. The entire tunnel was cordoned off, with officers scouring the surrounding woods for additional evidence. Grayson stood by the creek, deep in thought as Carl approached with a somber expression. "They found more inside the tunnel," Carl said, his voice low. "A shoe, small, maybe a woman's size, and more blood. Drag marks go further in too. Leads out into the woods, but we haven't found anything else yet." "Matches the pattern," Grayson replied, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Every time we get close, we find just enough to keep this thing alive, nothing to end it." Carl crossed his arms. "You think it's tied to the Parker farm mess?" "Same feeling," Grayson admitted. "This wasn't random. Someone left this here, left her here. Question is, why go to the trouble of hiding it in a place kids hang out?" "Could be sloppy," Carl offered. "Or maybe they wanted it found. Send a message." Grayson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the darkened tunnel. The weight of it all, the blood, the bones, the missing girls, it was like a shadow creeping over Riverfield, darker with each passing day. "Well," Carl said after a pause, "at least we got something. Piece of the puzzle, right?" Grayson smirked grimly. "Carl, we don't even know what the damn puzzle is." And with that, the two men stood in silence, the quiet forest around them feeling less like wilderness and more like a graveyard, holding far too many secrets. Revelation from a living witness. It wasn't often that someone survived. That was what kept Sheriff Tom Grayson up at night. The missing girls in Riverfield always stayed missing, or worse, their remains would surface in ways that only deepened the horror. But when the call came in about a young woman found staggering into the emergency room, bruised, battered, and barely holding herself together, Grayson's gut told him this might be the break they desperately needed. "Carl, grab your jacket, we're heading to County General," Grayson barked, already halfway out the door. Carl Mason looked up from his desk, his face scrunched in confusion. "What's going on?" "Witness," Grayson said shortly. He adjusted the badge on his chest as he practically stormed down the hallway with Carl at his heels. "Survivor. Young woman turned up at the ER, claims she escaped." Carl's face darkened as realization dawned on him. "Escaped? You mean from—" "I don't know yet," Grayson interrupted, cutting him off as they reached the cruiser. "But I damn well intend to find out." The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby hummed faintly as Grayson and Carl entered County General. The air smelled like antiseptic, cold and sterile, but underneath it, there was a strange tension. Nurses bustled through the halls, too consumed with their duties to offer more than a passing glance at the two men in uniform. "She's in room 4, a nurse said when Grayson flashed his badge. Her voice was low, her expression grim. "I'll warn you, she's in rough shape. Young, maybe 19 or 20. They barely got a name out of her before she collapsed. Lisa something— no, wait. Lauren Carter." Grayson froze for a brief moment. "Lauren Carter?" he repeated. Carl frowned. "Wait, wasn't she on the missing persons list?" Grayson confirmed, his tone sharpening. 6 months ago. Thought we'd lost her for good." The nurse nodded, lowering her voice sympathetically. "Whatever happened to her, it's bad. She's malnourished, bruised to hell, and has signs of being restrained for long periods. Shaking like a leaf, too. You'll have to go slow." Grayson thanked the nurse with a nod and motioned for Carl to follow. Room 4 was at the end of a narrow hallway, quieter than the rest of the ER. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed to feel. Grayson knocked gently before pushing the door open. Inside, Lauren sat on the hospital bed, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her blonde hair was tangled, and her face bore fading bruises. But it was her eyes that struck Grayson the most. They were wide, hollow, and darted nervously to every corner of the room as though she wasn't convinced she'd actually escaped. "Lauren?" Grayson said softly, stepping inside. His usual gruff tone was replaced with one of quiet reassurance. She flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't look directly at him. Instead, her hands tightened around the edges of the blanket. "I'm Sheriff Grayson," he continued, staying a careful distance away. "This is Deputy Mason. We're here to help you, all right? You're safe now." She didn't respond right away. Carl pulled a chair closer, setting it beside the hospital bed. But Grayson could tell she wasn't ready for that kind of closeness yet. After a long moment, her hoarse voice cracked the silence. "Safe!" she repeated, the word trembling on her lips. Her gaze flickered to Grayson, though she still didn't meet his eyes. He said... Carl's jaw tightened at her words, but it was Grayson who knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level. "Who's he? Lauren, who said that to you?" She shook her head violently, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I can't say his name. He'll find me." Grayson kept his voice steady, calm. "He won't find you, Lauren. I can promise you that. You're here now, and nobody gets to you here. But we need to know, who's behind this? Did he take you from the night market?" At the mention of the night market, her body stiffened. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "The truck. He grabbed me while I was walking to my car." Her hands instinctively moved to her wrists, which were covered in fresh bandages. "Tied my hands, threw me in the back. I couldn't see. It was dark. It smelled so bad, like meat that had been left out in the sun." Carl shot Grayson a glance. "Like Parker Farm," he murmured under his breath. Grayson nodded subtly but kept his attention on Lauren. "And where did he take you? Was it his house? A barn?" "A basement," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was cold, wet. The walls were concrete, but there was dirt everywhere, no windows, chains, like a room meant for animals." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked down at her trembling hands. "There were others." Grayson's stomach lurched. "Others?" he pressed gently. "You mean other girls?" "Yes." Her voice was louder now, almost desperate. "There were so many. Some of them didn't move. I don't know if they were alive. I heard him say things, though. He told the others to take care of it. That they'd feed the animals with what was left." Carl stood abruptly, muttering a curse under his breath, but Grayson's voice remained calm. He didn't have the luxury of exploding, not now. "Lauren, look at me," he said firmly, though his tone was kind. "Do you know who else was there? Did you see their faces?" She shook her head. "He wouldn't let me, but one of them was older." His voice, it was gravelly, rough. He was the one who gave orders. The others, 3 of them, maybe 4, they listened to him. Grayson leaned forward slightly, catching her eyes for the first time. "The older man. Does he have a name? Anything you overheard?" Her expression shifted, fear mixing with anger. "He called the younger one Ray. I don't know if it's a first name or nickname, but they kept yelling, 'Ray, get over here!' And the older one kept saying, 'No mistakes, quick and clean, always quick and clean.'" Her voice cracked again and she started sobbing softly. Grayson nodded slowly, resisting the instinct to press too hard. "You've done more than enough, Lauren. You're stronger than you think. You made it out. We're going to handle the rest." She didn't look convinced, but Grayson wasn't lying. For the first time in months, they had a lead. A living witness. He glanced at Carl, who gave him a single, tense nod. They didn't need to speak to know what had to come next. Back in the hallway, Carl leaned heavily against the wall, running a hand down his face. "Jesus, Sheriff, she's lucky to be alive." "She's more than lucky," Grayson said, his voice low and grim. "She's our key to ending this. Call the station. Tell them to pull everyone. I want names. I want records. We find every Ray within 50 miles. And the older one?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "If he's as careful as she says, he's running everything. And I don't care what it takes. We're gonna find him." For once, Carl didn't crack a joke or argue. Instead, he simply nodded, tension radiating off him as he pulled out his phone. Meanwhile, Grayson stayed where he was, staring back at the closed door to room 4. Lauren's words echoed in his mind. He hoped to God she was wrong, but deep down, he knew better. Unexpected evidence. As the investigation progressed to its next stage, investigators focused on analyzing the evidence and traces collected at the crime scene. What initially seemed clear, based on the Dieppe family's testimony of self-defense, began unraveling with the discovery of small but significant inconsistencies. These surprising pieces of evidence not only shifted the direction of the investigation, but also posed painful questions about the hidden truths behind this tragedy. Blood patterns and unusual trajectories. At the crime scene, the iron rod was identified as the weapon that caused the severe injuries to Jang Guo-han's body. Forensic evidence revealed that the blood splatter from the head wound formed distinct patterns. While this might seem minor to an outsider, for the investigators, it was a scientifically precise indicator that the victim had been attacked while still standing upright. The blood trajectories contradicted the family's initial claims that they reacted only after Han lunged at them with a glass bottle. Additionally, the iron rod bore fingerprints not only from Van Hao, who admitted to using it, but also from Dong Pong. Although Dong Pong had testified that he only held Han back for Van Hao to attack, the fingerprints suggested he also wielded the rod, possibly coordinating with his son during the incident. The knife and suspicious wound. Another piece of evidence that shifted perceptions was the bloodied knife found at the scene, an item that discredited the family's original testimony. Initially, Van Looy claimed the knife belonged to Jang Guo-han, and that he held it to threaten the family. However, upon further examination, experts discovered that the blood on the knife did not belong to Han, but instead to Van Looy herself. Moreover, the analysis showed that the cut was a clean, perpendicular slice, more likely self-inflicted than sustained during a scuffle. This raised new questions in the investigators' minds. Why was Van Looy injured by the very knife she claimed Han had used? Was this a deliberate act to fabricate evidence, or was it simply a momentary mistake amid the chaos? The shattered bottle and inconsistent actions. The shattered glass bottle found at the scene, which the family described as Han's weapon of threat, also presented inconsistencies. Upon analysis, the broken shards and fracture lines did not resemble those from a bottle smashed forcefully onto the floor, as per the family's account. Instead, the break pattern suggested an impact with a harder object at waist or knee height. This led to speculation that the family themselves might have broken the bottle to create the appearance of Han being the initial aggressor. Furthermore, the glass fragments scattered around Han's body did not align with the family's description of where he was standing when the bottle was reportedly broken. Forensic experts confirmed that the placement of the shards didn't match the alleged circumstances, further casting doubt on the family's statements. Illogical movement traces. Beyond analyzing blood and physical items, the investigators also examined footprints and movement patterns on the floor. Some trails indicated the victim had stepped backward before collapsing, but the backward steps did not correspond to a direct struggle. The traces suggested no clear signs of intense grappling. Moreover, a significant pool of blood was found near the window, far from where Han supposedly fell, according to the family's narrative. This discrepancy hinted that Han might have been attacked while retreating toward the window, and was then dragged back to the center of the living room, a scenario vastly different from the claim that he fell there naturally. Conflicting testimony from a neighbor. Not all evidence was physical. Witness testimonies further complicated the case. A neighbor, Mrs. Mann, stated that on the day of the incident, she was sitting outside when she heard arguing coming from the deep house about 5 minutes before a scream rang out. According to Mrs. Mann, "I heard Dong Fong shout, 'What? You're here to cause trouble again? Today, I'll deal with you.' Then there was the sound of something slamming, followed by a woman screaming. This account starkly contradicted the Deep family's portrayal of themselves as the targets of Han's attack. Mrs. Mann's testimony made the police question whether the conflict had begun with the Deep family members themselves. Discrepancy between testimony and reality. From the discoveries at the scene to the inconsistencies in testimony and witness accounts, the police quickly identified numerous mismatched details between the family's statements and the evidence. These issues not only deepened suspicions but also raised a larger pressing question. Was the Deep family concealing crucial information about what had transpired? A storm of new doubts. The unexpected revelations not only unveiled hidden complexities within the Deep family's story, but also roused intense emotions among the local community. With each truth uncovered, the narrative of the case became increasingly tangled and harrowing. Police, neighbors, and even the Deep family themselves found themselves ensnared in an intricate web of facts, mistakes, and despair that made reversing course or seeking clarity seem impossible. The relentless pursuit. The air in the Riverfield Sheriff's Department was electric. After months of dead ends, evasive clues, and sleepless nights, Sheriff Tom Grayson finally had his shot. Their shot. The picture was clearer now than it had been in months. Clarence Hargrove, Raymond Burton, Ethan Cole, and the shadowy fourth accomplice. Their names were etched into Grayson's mind like scars. He wasn't going to rest until they were caught. No more innocent lives would be lost. No more bodies discarded like afterthoughts. Carl Mason stormed into Grayson's office, slamming a folder down on the desk. "Sheriff, we've got it!" Grayson looked up from the map spread across his desk. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, the lines on his face deeper than ever, but inside there was a spark, a determination that burned hotter than any fatigue. "What have you got, Carl? Tell me it's good." Carl barely paused for breath. Phone logs from the burner we recovered at Parker Farm finally came through. They pinged a tower near the old paper mill 2 nights ago. We cross-checked that with the delivery records Hank told us about, the ones that match Ethan Cole's movements. Guess what? They line up. We've got their location. He leaned forward, planting his hands on Grayson's desk. "They're holed up at the mill, Sheriff." Grayson's heart jumped into his throat as adrenaline kicked in. "You're sure? No more loose threads this time? I'm not sending a team into another wild goose chase." Carl nodded confidently. "It fits. Surveillance from some gas stations out near the county line picked up movement from a truck matching the description Lauren Carter gave. Same make, same model, same dents. They've been moving supplies. The paper trail, the delivery schedules, the tire tracks we found near that tunnel, it all points to the mill. This is it, Tom. They're there." The briefing room came alive with activity 30 minutes later. Deputies swarmed, grabbing vests, radios, and gear for what was shaping up to be the biggest operation the Riverfield Sheriff's Department had ever led. On the corkboard at the front of the room, Grayson had drawn a crude map of the paper mill and its surrounding area. Grayson stood at the head of the room, his voice steady and hard as steel. "All right, listen up. This isn't just another raid, folks. This is the raid. These bastards have been killing, maiming, and destroying lives for over 2 damn years. They think they can hide in plain sight, moving around Riverfield like shadows. But tonight, we finish this. Tonight, we bring them in." The room buzzed with quiet, intense energy. "Here's the game plan." Grayson turned and tapped on the map. "The mill's got 3 points of entry. The north loading dock, the west foreman's office, and an old access tunnel on the south side that's been forgotten for years. We cover them all. I want 2 teams on the north dock. It's the most likely spot for a getaway. Carl, you take 3 men and sweep the foreman's office. I'll take the tunnel with another team." Carl frowned. "The tunnel? You sure you want to be crawling around in the dark, Sheriff? That place ain't exactly OSHA approved." Grayson shot him a look. "You think they care about OSHA, Carl? It's the only way to keep them boxed in if they make a run for it. Besides, if I'm going to ask you all to charge in, the least I can do is lead from the front." Carl snorted. "Fair enough, but you better not get yourself killed, Tom. It'll mess up my paperwork." Grayson smirked faintly. "Don't worry, Carl. I've got every intention of dragging these bastards out in cuffs." The convoy of patrol cars rolled out of the station just after sunset, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The paper mill was a relic from Riverfield's past, abandoned, forgotten, and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Grayson could see the looming silhouette of its crumbling smokestacks as they approached, the same ones he'd stared at as a boy when the mill was still alive with workers and machines. "Radio check," Grayson said into his walkie-talkie. He was already in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his vest strapped tight, his revolver on his hip. "North team in position," came a voice through the static. "West team here," Carl chimed in. "Keep up, Sheriff. We'll save you a seat at the bar." Grayson rolled his eyes, but couldn't help the faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Tunnel team moving in," he replied. The tunnel entrance was exactly as Grayson remembered it, a rusted grate barely visible through thick overgrowth. It hadn't been used in decades, but someone had hacked through the vines recently. Grayson sucked in a breath. "They're here," he thought. The raid began without ceremony. Grayson's team entered the tunnel quietly, flashlights cutting through the damp air as echoes of every footstep bounced off the walls. Meanwhile, Carl's team breached the foreman's office with precision, cutting through the locked doors like butter. According to the plan, the North Dock team would wait until anyone inside tried to escape. Minutes ticked by like hours. "Sheriff!" One of the deputies behind him stopped suddenly, nearly stumbling over something in the tunnel. Grayson turned his flashlight toward the ground. A trail of dark smears, blood, led further down the corridor, along with faint drag marks. "Shit!" Grayson muttered. "Stay close, we're getting somewhere." Carl's crackling voice came over the radio just as Grayson's team reached the tunnel's halfway point. Sheriff, we've got something. The office is empty, but there's fresh food on the table. These guys were here. They had to leave in a hurry. Grayson keyed the radio. Copy that, Carl. Tunnel team just found blood. We're closing in. At the north dock, the action exploded. Two figures emerged from the shadows, running like hell toward an old pickup truck parked near the loading bay. Freeze, Sheriff's Department, one of the deputies shouted, his flashlight cutting through the night. Instead of stopping, the men bolted toward the truck. One of them, a bald, muscular figure with a black glove still on one hand, shoved the deputy out of the way as he leapt into the driver's seat. It's Ray! A deputy yelled, aiming his sidearm as the truck roared to life. Shots rang out, tires squealed, and chaos took over as the truck barreled through the barricade. Inside the mill, Grayson's team broke through the old tunnel and stumbled into a scene straight from hell. Blood-stained tables, chains hanging from the ceiling, and scattered tools painted an unmistakable picture. This was where it all happened. Son of a bitch, one of the deputies muttered, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Grayson ignored the comment, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from one of the back rooms. Get ready, he murmured, his revolver drawn. Moments later, Carl's team burst in from the other side, converging with Grayson. Together they cornered a scrawny, trembling man, Ethan Cole. He didn't put up a fight, collapsing to his knees with his hands raised in surrender. Where's Hargrove? Where's Ray? Grayson demanded. Ethan's lips quivered as tears streamed down his face. I don't know. They're gone. I was just supposed to clean. Please don't kill me. Grayson's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. You're going to tell us everything, Ethan, or God help me, you're not leaving this building. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of the paper mill, one thing was clear. The chase wasn't over yet. Ray was still out there. Hargrove was still pulling the strings. But now, Grayson had Ethan, and Ethan had answers. What's the play now, Sheriff? Carl asked, his tone blunt but hopeful. Grayson slid his revolver back into its holster, his eyes hard and unrelenting. We keep chasing. No breaks, no stops. We don't let them breathe until this town is free. Carl smirked faintly. In that case, better make another pot of coffee. Grayson didn't smile back. The hunt wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The relentless pursuit. The air in the Riverfield Sheriff's Department was electric. After months of dead ends, evasive clues, and sleepless nights, Sheriff Tom Grayson finally had his shot. Their shot. The picture was clearer now than it had been in months. Clarence Hargrove, Raymond Burton, Ethan Cole, and the shadowy fourth accomplice. Their names were etched into Grayson's mind like scars. He wasn't going to rest until they were caught. No more innocent lives would be lost. No more bodies discarded like afterthoughts. Carl Mason stormed into Grayson's office, slamming a folder down on the desk. Sheriff, we've got it! Grayson looked up from the map spread across his desk. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, the lines on his face deeper than ever, but inside there was a spark, a determination that burned hotter than any fatigue. What have you got, Carl? Tell me it's good. Carl barely paused for breath. Phone logs from the burner we recovered at Parker Farm finally came through. They pinged a tower near the old paper mill 2 nights ago. We cross-checked that with the delivery records Hank told us about, the ones that match Ethan Cole's movements. Guess what? They line up. We've got their location. He leaned forward, planting his hands on Grayson's desk. They're holed up at the mill, Sheriff. Grayson's heart jumped into his throat as adrenaline kicked in. You're sure? No more loose threads this time? I'm not sending a team into another wild goose chase. Carl nodded confidently. It fits. Surveillance from some gas stations out near the county line picked up movement from a truck matching the description Lauren Carter gave. Same make, same model, same dents. They've been moving supplies. The paper trail, the delivery schedules, the tire tracks we found near that tunnel. It all points to the mill. This is it, Tom. They're there. The briefing room came alive with activity 30 minutes later. Deputies swarmed, grabbing vests, radios, and gear for what was shaping up to be the biggest operation the Riverfield Sheriff's Department had ever led. On the corkboard at the front of the room, Grayson had drawn a crude map of the paper mill and its surrounding area. Grayson stood at the head of the room, his voice steady and hard as steel. All right, listen up. This isn't just another raid, folks. This is the raid. These bastards have been killing, maiming, and destroying lives for over 2 damn years. They think they can hide in plain sight, moving around Riverfield like shadows. But tonight, we finish this. Tonight, we bring them in. The room buzzed with quiet, intense energy. Here's the game plan. Grayson turned and tapped on the map. The mill's got 3 points of entry. The north loading dock, the west foreman's office, and an old access tunnel on the south side that's been forgotten for years. We cover them all. I want 2 teams on the north dock. It's the most likely spot for a getaway. Carl, you take 3 men and sweep the foreman's office. I'll take the tunnel with another team. Carl frowned. The tunnel? You sure you want to be crawling around in the dark, Sheriff? That place ain't exactly OSHA approved. Grayson shot him a look. You think they care about OSHA, Carl? It's the only way to keep them boxed in if they make a run for it. Besides, if I'm going to ask you all to charge in, the least I can do is lead from the front. Carl snorted. Fair enough, but you better not get yourself killed, Tom. It'll mess up my paperwork. Grayson smirked faintly. Don't worry, Carl. I've got every intention of dragging these bastards out in cuffs. The convoy of patrol cars rolled out of the station just after sunset, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The paper mill was a relic from Riverfield's past, abandoned, forgotten, and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Grayson could see the looming silhouette of its crumbling smokestacks as they approached, the same ones he'd stared at as a boy when the mill was still alive with workers and machines. Radio check, Grayson said into his walkie-talkie. He was already in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his vest strapped tight, his revolver on his hip. North team in position, came a voice through the static. West team here, Carl chimed in. Keep up, Sheriff. We'll save you a seat at the bar. Grayson rolled his eyes but couldn't help the faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Tunnel team moving in, he replied. The tunnel entrance was exactly as Grayson remembered it, a rusted grate barely visible through thick overgrowth. It hadn't been used in decades, but someone had hacked through the vines recently. Grayson sucked in a breath. They're here, he thought. The raid began without ceremony. Grayson's team entered the tunnel quietly, flashlights cutting through the damp air as echoes of every footstep bounced off the walls. Meanwhile, Carl's team breached the foreman's office with precision, cutting through the locked doors like butter. According to the plan, the North Dock team would wait until anyone inside tried to escape. Minutes ticked by like hours. Sheriff. One of the deputies behind him stopped suddenly, nearly stumbling over something in the tunnel. Grayson turned his flashlight toward the ground. A trail of dark smears, blood, led further down the corridor, along with faint drag marks. Shit, Grayson muttered. Stay close, we're getting somewhere. Carl's crackling voice came over the radio just as Grayson's team reached the tunnel's halfway point. Sheriff, we've got something. The office is empty, but there's fresh food on the table. These guys were here. They had to leave in a hurry. Grayson keyed the radio. Copy that, Carl. Tunnel team just found blood. We're closing in. At the North Dock, the action exploded. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, running like hell toward an old pickup truck parked near the loading bay. Freeze! Sheriff's Department! One of the deputies shouted, his flashlight cutting through the night. Instead of stopping, the men bolted toward the truck. One of them, a bald, muscular figure with a black glove still on one hand, shoved the deputy out of the way as he leapt into the driver's seat. It's Ray! A deputy yelled, aiming his sidearm as the truck roared to life. Shots rang out, tires squealed, and chaos took over as the truck barreled through the barricade. Inside the mill, Grayson's team broke through the old tunnel and stumbled into a scene straight from hell. Blood-stained tables, chains hanging from the ceiling, and scattered tools painted an unmistakable picture. This was where it all happened. Son of a bitch, one of the deputies muttered, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Grayson ignored the comment, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from one of the back rooms. Get ready, he murmured, his revolver drawn. Moments later, Carl's team burst in from the other side, converging with Grayson. Together they cornered a scrawny, trembling man, Ethan Cole. He didn't put up a fight, collapsing to his knees with his hands raised in surrender. Where's Hargrove? Where's Ray? Grayson demanded. Ethan's lips quivered as tears streamed down his face. I don't know. They're gone. I was just supposed to clean. Please don't kill me. Grayson's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. You're going to tell us everything, Ethan, or God help me, you're not leaving this building. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of the paper mill, one thing was clear, the chase wasn't over yet. Ray was still out there, Hargrove was still pulling the strings, but now Grayson had Ethan, and Ethan had answers. What's the play now, Sheriff? Carl asked, his tone blunt but hopeful. Grayson slid his revolver back into its holster, his eyes hard and unrelenting. We keep chasing. No breaks, no stops. We don't let them breathe until this town is free. Carl smirked faintly. In that case, better make another pot of coffee. Grayson didn't smile back. The hunt wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Morong cho toi muk ne, 1, ket en vabai hok. Vietai not ko the voi fongkach, my vabang ting on my vieto kwak hoi toi, ne. Here's an extended version of Convictions and Lessons written in American storytelling style with dialogue. The courtroom was packed wall to wall. The kind of quiet hum filled the room that only came from people holding their collective breath. Every pew-like seat in the Riverfield courthouse had been taken, with dozens more townsfolk standing along the back wall and lining the balcony above. Sheriff Tom Grayson sat near the front, his usual stoic expression masking the swirl of emotions inside him. Justice was finally within reach, or so he hoped. Deputy Carl Mason sat quietly beside him, fidgeting with an empty coffee cup he had refused to throw away, as though it gave him something to hold on to. He leaned toward Grayson, his voice low. "You think this'll stick? You think the jury sees what we see?" Grayson exhaled slowly, his fingers locking tightly together on his lap. "The evidence is ironclad, Carl. The prosecutors pieced it together perfectly. It'll stick." He paused, then added quietly, "It has to." Carl grunted softly in response, not convinced, but resigned. He settled back in his seat as the judge entered the room, the gallery standing as one before taking their seats again in tense unison. Across the room, separated by 5 armed officers, sat the 3 men responsible for plunging Riverfield into a nightmare. Clarence Hargrove didn't so much as twitch, his cold, gravelly demeanor unchanged. If the older man felt worry, he masked it perfectly. His hands rested lightly on the table as though he didn't care about the weight of what was coming. Next to him was Raymond Burton, Ray to Grayson and his team. The bald butcher had none of Hargrove's calm exterior. His broad shoulders seemed hunched as though folding inward against the stares boring into him from every angle of the room. Disgust, hate, rage, all of it directed at him as the man who handled the physical horrors they'd uncovered at Parker Farm and beyond. Ethan Cole, the youngest of the trio and the weakest link, sat slouched at the table. His frail frame visibly trembled, his sunken eyes darting nervously between the jury and his own sweating hands. Ethan looked like he knew what everyone in the room thought of him, pathetic, complicit, a coward who did nothing to stop the horrors he had helped facilitate. The prosecutor stood, all sharp-edged confidence, as he approached the jury with precise steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, "today, the truth about what happened in Riverfield has come into full view. Thanks to the tireless efforts of Sheriff Grayson and his department, we finally have the facts. And they are horrifying." Grayson leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't need to hear the speech again, he'd been living it for months. The discovery of the girl's remains, the dark secrets hidden in that basement, the blood-soaked tools, the literal, revolting truth of what Hargrove and his group had been doing. The prosecutor painted the picture in vivid detail for the jury, sparing nothing. "These men treated human beings as commodities," he said, gesturing sharply toward the defendant's table. "They kidnapped young women, daughters, sisters, and friends, holding them in chains like livestock. Then, when they were finished, when their victims were broken, they disposed of their bodies in the most vile way imaginable." His voice rose. "Grinding them down, selling them into feed, hiding their crimes by feeding them to animals." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the back stifled a sob. It sounded like a wound reopening. Deputy Mason muttered under his breath, "Christ. Even after all this, hearing it again hits like a damn truck." Grayson gave a small nod but didn't turn his head. "Good," he said flatly. "They need to feel it. They need to know exactly what these bastards are." After hours of arguments, forensic evidence, videos, and survivor testimony, including the harrowing account given by Lauren Carter, the jury was sent to deliberate. Grayson and Carl stepped outside for air while the rest of the crowd stayed, vibrating with tension. Carl leaned against a battered trash can just outside the courthouse steps, lighting a cigarette. "I'll tell you, Tom, we've had some rough cases. A few that haunt me. But this one, this is the one that keeps me up at night." Grayson shoved his hands in his pockets and stared out at the gray skies above the old courthouse square. "Because every failure led to this," he said softly. "Every girl we didn't save, every lead we didn't catch fast enough, every time this town begged us for answers and we just didn't have them yet." His jaw tightened. "That's what keeps me up." Carl nodded silently, blowing a steady stream of smoke into the chilly air. "And now, you get to feel what? Closure?" Grayson was silent for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Closure doesn't exist, not for this, not for those families, but this is accountability, and that'll have to do." By the time the jury returned, night had fallen. The glow of the overhead lighting felt harsh, fluorescent, buzzing faintly as the courtroom fell to complete silence. The judge, an older man with a hard expression, looked down at the paper passed into his hand by the lead juror. The forewoman, a composed woman in her 50s, rose to her feet. On the charges of murder, illegal trafficking, and conspiracy to conceal violent crime, we find Clarence Hargrove guilty. A wave of release swept through the room, gasps and a few muffled sobs. Hargrove didn't even blink. On the charges of accessory to murder, kidnapping, and desecration of human remains, we find Raymond Burton guilty. Ray swallowed hard, his stoic mask cracking for a brief second. Grayson caught it. He'd been waiting for that moment. And on the charges of illegal transport, accessory to violent crime, and conspiracy, we find Ethan Cole guilty. Ethan collapsed into his chair, defeated. The chains around his wrists rattled loudly in the otherwise silent courtroom. When the judge moved to announce the sentences, she didn't mince words. "Mr. Hargrove, Mr. Burton, Mr. Cole," she began, her sharp, deliberate tone cutting through the room. "You operated in the shadows, turning this town's trust and quiet safety into a personal hunting ground for your sick, twisted operation. You preyed on the innocent, you silenced them, you destroyed families, left them looking for answers for years. Today, there will be answers." She turned to the gallery. "And today, Riverfield begins to heal." Hargrove and Burton were sentenced to death without possibility of appeal. Ethan Cole, though spared the same fate for his cooperation in assisting the investigation, received life without parole in a maximum security prison. The verdicts hit the room with mixed emotions: relief, grief, anger, and, from the families of the victims, quiet tears of justice. Outside, the cold wind cut across the courthouse steps as Grayson and Carl stood near their car, both silent and looking out over the square. A few reporters lingered, desperate for a comment, but neither man was in the mood for grandstanding. "You think it'll change anything? For the town, I mean?" Carl asked finally, breaking the silence. Grayson shrugged, his gaze distant. "It'll give them answers. Not closure, but answers. That's the best we can do." Carl nodded, tossing his cigarette stub into the gutter. "And us, Sheriff? You think we'll sleep easier now?" Grayson turned, fixing Carl with a steady look, his face etched with weariness. "No," he said simply, "but we'll keep going anyway." They climbed into the cruiser, the hum of the engine breaking the stillness as they pulled out onto the quiet streets of Riverfield. The case was over, but the shadow it cast over the town would linger for years. Justice had been served. The lessons of vigilance, trust, and the lurking darkness even in small towns were burned into Riverfield's memory, and for Sheriff Grayson, the fight for peace, within the town and within himself, was far from over. In the courtroom and beyond, the case left one final lesson written in the hearts of Riverfield's people. Evil doesn't vanish completely, it waits in the unnoticed corners. Their victory wasn't erasing it, but bringing it screaming into the light.